Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski.
Today in the podcast, we are in my hometown with someone who's been running through the decades, been part of the running scene, not only as a runner, but as a journalist and an author. A good perspective will know the runners and know running and the history. Welcome today on the podcast, George Hancock. Hi, George.
Hi, Matt. Really fascinated with your site here. Last couple of days, I've been listening to a lot of the runners, and it brings back a lot of memories. Now, to be honest, Kerry Green, I knew of him. I never met him personally. Now, we may have raced together. I'm almost positive he doesn't know who I am. Right now, I would probably have a rough time picking him out. But he said something in his first podcast that I found fascinating because it contradicted some local running history. And I just found that really fascinating. And it was the picture you posted, the run to Ligonier. I
Okay.
was always told that run started because Kerry Green was leaving the area, and that's the path he took. He lived in Westmont, and he was going to Ligonier, I guess, to Route 30, and he was going to Ohio, and that was to commemorate him leaving. That
That might,
on Hess story, but
I wonder if that was a particular edition of it.
it might have been later because I don't even remember what year he left the area, but
That picture and the one we talked about, that was 1976 summer. And Kerry was still at IUP, and he
okay.
would stay at IUP a couple more years. Then he moved to Ohio. It may have been one of the later editions was his last run to Ligonier as he was moving to Zanesville or something. That may have been it.
Okay.
That had started a couple years earlier. Okay, let's get your background and timing of this. Where did you go to high school, and were you a competitive athlete growing up?
Yes, I am a Bishop McCort grad, graduated in 71. We actually just several years ago had our 50th anniversary, and that was a lot of fun. I was in the era 71, we had probably 350 graduates. Now think about that. 350 graduates. I grew up in the Oakland section of Stony Creek Township, right below Georstown. My school district would have been Johnstown. I graduated from St. Benedict's 8th grade, and you hate to say it, I was a football player, and the coaches from Bishop McCort, Johnstown, and Richland all come to talk to us. They did not use the word recruiting in those days, but they did come to talk to you. Now, the Richland coach knew if you lived in Stony Creek, depending on where you lived, you couldn't go to Richland. And I really did want to go to Richland. I asked him, is there a way? He said, no, there's no way. So it was a choice between Bishop McCort and Johnstown. I chose McCort because my class at Johnstown would have been over 1,000 students at that time. And it was a good school at that time, very good school at that time, but I didn't want to be lost in the crowd. So I went to McCort. And basically, I played football and I was a runner. I was on the track team. But my butt was that something happened in my senior year. I did not play football my senior year, and I wasn't on the track team my senior year. Not that I got in any kind of trouble or anything like that, but before my senior year began, the main reason was because I came from a big family and I was accepted at UPJ. So before I started my senior year, I was accepted. That package came with taking college level courses, okay, which were after school, after classes. And it was a fantastic opportunity. It didn't cost me or my family anything. So I did that. That's what I did. I was always a runner. I started road running for football at St. Benedict's, probably 65, because I graduated St. Benedict's 67. So I started running the roads in 65. Never saw anybody. People would come up to pull up alongside of me. And in those days, it wasn't scary and everything okay. Remember the Georgetown police asking a couple times, "Is everything okay?"
Yeah, you're out here by yourself running down the
Well,
road.
I mentioned that in the book I wrote. The police chief at the time was Nicholas Nicoletti, or Nicoletti, Chief Nicoletti. And he pulled up alongside of me one time, and I was on Walters Avenue running towards the Armory. And he said, You okay?" I told him what it was. I played football for, we said, "How far are you running?" I said, "I really don't know. I know what it is now, but at that time, I didn't know." I left my home in Oakland, and there was a tank sitting up there at the road at the Armory, and that was my turnaround point. I said, "I'm running to the tank." He said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "Well, carry on." And I did that before every season and after the end of the season. I didn't really start road running until 1973. And the reason was I had the time. Every year, all the guys and some of the young ladies, we would try to get summer jobs at Bethlehem Steel, which involved going down, taking a massive test. At that time, and I didn't know this really well, but the summer program is how people got into Bethlehem to work too. So you were up against people trying to get a full-time job. And I was never lucky. I had a couple friends that did. So I'm working part-time. I had the time. So I was a runner in high school. So I figured, what the hey, I'm going to just start running again. And you got to think of what was going on in 1973. I did run from home a little bit, but I found out that the traffic was not the best, even if I was going up Walters Avenue and Bedford Street, and it was just too crowded. So what a lot of us did was we drove to the old Richland Middle School, parked there at the track. You had UPJ on across the street. We just start running from there. You were above the traffic. And I did that for decades until I actually started living in Richland. And that's pretty much how it started. I had the time. And by the end of the summer, that would have been the beginning of my junior year at UPJ, I was running a steady 6 miles every day. Felt great. I
So
was in
that
new territory. I didn't know what it was. What I didn't have anybody giving me coaching advice, so I was pretty much on my own.
Okay. So this is really fun for me to hear because I know all those names. I went to St. Benedict's. And those are Catholic schools, both St. Benedict's and Bishop McCort had to pay a tuition. I have no idea what the numbers were. We didn't have very much money, but we did have enough money to go St. Benedict's, barely. And Bishop McCort, similar. I lived in Belmont, so I was in Johnstown School District. My older siblings went to Johnstown. Then in the middle of my 8th grade year at St. Benedict's, we moved a few blocks just on the other side of Belmont, and I moved into the Richland School District. So that all rings a bell. Let's talk about when you started to see other runners.
73, I started running in, it had been right after the term ended at UPJ. It was April and May, that time frame. The very first runner I ran into, and he did the same thing. He got out of his car, and I waved to him. I didn't know who he was at the time, but a week or so later, I found out Steve Molnar. We started talking, and I had mentioned that I was a student at UPJ, and he said, "You on the cross country team?" I said, "No." He said, "How much are you running?" I said, "I'm doing about 6 or 7 miles a day." He said, "That's pretty good." So he was the first one I ran into. Then I eventually met some of his other brothers, Dave and the younger brother, John.
Don was a year older than me.
Yeah. Actually, Dawn and John. Dave he was a little bit older than I am, but he was probably the first runner I see. Now, as we got closer to the start of the school year, that parking lot would fill up with Richland cross country runners. And by that time, Votech had a decent school, very good athletic program. So some of them were there too. And you had the runners from across the street at UPJ. So we would all talk among ourselves. And at that time, I'm almost positive there might have been one or two others. I think I was the only non-school runner out there.
Fall of 1973. Were you doing that then? The fall of 73?
Yes, I was still running, and that was my starting point.
I was on the Richland High School cross country team starting
Well,
in fall.
we ran together a couple times because I remember one time.
I don't remember really. That's too long ago. That's great.
I don't know if you'll remember this story, but talking to Steve, and even though there was no racing or anything going on my part, I was breaking the workouts down. I would run on the track. I asked the football coaches if that would bother their practice because I was running, they were practicing, and they said no. He said, "If you're here long enough and if somebody's misbehaving, we're going to have a run with you." But I would do that. I ran on the old Richmond cross country course, and I was running on the local roads. That's where I ran with you one time. I was doing mile repeats. If you could think of that loop around on Schoolhouse, back behind the high school, the old high school, and up Highfield Avenue, that was I called it a mile loop, but it was probably like
Right.
1.3, 1.4. I was doing mile repeats, and you jumped in. And you said, "What are we doing today?" I guess you thought I was going to be running out Schoolhouse Road or Rotec Drive or something, but say, I'm just doing mile repeats. And you did. You stayed with me. I probably did about 5 or 6 mile repeats on those. Depending on where we were, we would slow the pace down, but then we'd pick it up pretty good. But you hung with me,
Brilliant.
which was good.
That was my first. I ran junior high track in ninth grade in that spring, and that was the first time I'd been on a track. And yeah, so I was okay, and I thought of myself as a runner then. So you were a runner. That was just something you did all the time from earlier years, right?
Pretty much my career at Bishop McCort is a runner. I actually started as a sprinter. And by my junior year, which would have been my last year running track, I was running a mile and 2 mile. It was just because I was able to run. I was that newer generation that I didn't really specialize. I could run 100, I could run a 200. If they had to put me to 400, I could do that. I could run them up. And Steve Molnar mentioned, boy, I seen you run, I run behind you, and you know how to hold a pace. And I think that was the key. I was short, lightweight, and I could run holding a pace. And then when I got onto the roads, it just took off. I was able to do that. I had no problem running on the roads. Of course, you had to watch the traffic in those days, but I ran, I enjoyed it, so I just kept doing it. I
Okay.
ran all the way through graduation and I started to attract a little bit of attention. I didn't start running races until 1976. My first race was the Greater Johnstown 10K. I didn't run 75 because, honest with you, it was the football coach at the time at Richland, Fred Yanity. He come up to me. He said, "Are you running a 10K?" This was in 1975. And I said, "No, I don't be honest. I didn't know anything about it." I said, "If I would have known about it, I could have jumped in and run that the very first one, but I didn't know about it, even though it was not publicized the way it is today, but it was in the Tribune, but I just wasn't aware of it. And so I didn't run. But 76 on, I ran.
I didn't know about it either. Fred Yanity was also the track coach at the high
Right.
school. He didn't mention it. I would have known him by 1975. Probably met Fred in the spring, my sophomore track season. I didn't know anything about road racing. So what was the first road race, the first Johnstown race that you ran in? What was it like for facilities and how many people ran?
It was an incredible run. Again, this was my first road race, not first race because I ran at McCord and we did some U type races in the off season. So I was familiar with running with crowds and whatnot, but this was the first. And I was doing everything on my own other than some pointers from Steve Molnar. I was getting help, but not coaching help because by that time, Runner's World, Running Times, and later in the end of the 70s, there was a magazine called The Runner. And of course, late 70s, you had Jim Fix wrote that fantastic book. Probably read that about 5 times, getting information and whatnot. But the first race was really something. I was really excited. I was pre-registered, so all I had to do was get down the day of the race. And at that time, the race was a Saturday morning. We met at the War Memorial. That's where the registration was. And you parked downtown, rode the incline up to the start. And the race start was right there. They did the 10K first, and then they ran the marathon after that. Now, didn't know what to expect. To me, it looked like there were hundreds and hundreds of people, but I think it turned out there was probably less than 200. But anybody and everybody that was a good 10K runner or a 10K wannabe good runner was there. So there was I remember talking to all kind of good people. Met Coral Hatfield up there. Those guys would come in. A lot of good runners from State College, Altoona, and around the area. Plus, the one thing that until you hit almost the 80s, there wasn't really a whole lot of local runners. There was a few, but not many. it seems like the Johnstown running boom didn't start until the 80s. The
Well,
runners that were there were good.
there were the ultra runner set,
Right.
Steve
Yeah.
Molnar, Kerry Green, and John
John Hess,
Hess.
John Hess.
They went to New York and ran the JFK 50-miler laps around Central Park and won it as a team. They talk about they would, every 5 miles they'd come around, there'd be a table with defizzed. They'd just grab a bottle of Coke, defizz. What was the Johnstown Trail? Must have been an entry fee. Were there medals? Were there water stations?
There were water stations. The Greater Johnstown YMCA sponsored the race, and they had a couple other sponsors, but I can't remember the gentleman's name who was affiliated with the Y. He had a athletic background, but he made sure that there were medical facilities. There were ambulances on the course. There were people. The traffic control was excellent. We had a great run through Westmont. To be honest, I don't think there was any kind of trophies at the end, and they didn't do age group awards at that time. So it was basically just the overall finishers. And I honestly don't remember what it was, but I want to think because of some of the other races in the 70s, they might have been ribbons. We are blue, red, and
You
white.
think you had numbers?
That's a good question. If they did, it was popsicle 6 with a number on it, just like the old days of cross country. I honestly don't remember that. I know we had a race number on, but I don't think they had the tearaway bibs at that time. I don't think that started until late 70s, the 80s.
All right. So were you a good student in high school?
Yes, I was a very good student. That's pretty much how I got that early enrollment to UPJ. I was good in most subjects with the exception of math and science, and I wasn't good in them because I didn't care about them. I was a
What,
social studies, humanities type person.
what was your major at UPJ?
UPJ, I majored in U.S. history.
Did you encounter Steve Littleton?
I did. I did run into Steve because in those days, in the 70s, if you were running, you stood out. So, and he actually approached me one time. We might have actually had some classes together. One of his teammates from Richmond was Jim Fella. He was like a dual major, so he was taking a lot of history courses. So we were in a lot of classes together. He may actually introduce me to Steve. I'm almost positive we were in a class or two. I can't remember. I know Jim Fallon was in a lot of my classes, and they would ask, where are you running and whatnot? And I would say a lot of times I'm 5 or 6 o'clock. I would be over at the Richmond Middle School in the parking lot, and I'd take off from there because it was safe. Because you have to think of what was going on 1973 into 1974, right up the road, the old Richland Drive-In. They took that down and they built this fantastic mall there. Well, that's great for the area, but if you're a road runner, man, did that put traffic in there where there wasn't people. Oh, and they would, oh, that was just incredible. The amount of traffic was through there. You know what? I stayed with it though, because as the mall got bigger and better, the roads got bigger and better, and they're actually put a berm there. I know it wasn't for me, but I ran on that berm through the traffic.
That's great. In that era, 1975, 76, delivered newspapers. If something happened, I missed a school bus, I had to run from just the Johnstown, Belmont area. I'd run that 5 miles and run to school all through that traffic and kind of take the back roads, but that's great to think about. All right. How far afield did you go, and when did you venture out and do road races outside of Johnstown? How quickly did you find those?
Well, I have my handy running book right here. I wish you could. Yeah, maybe we'll try to put the camera on again. But this is he won't our idea. He was telling me it's just a plain, ordinary blank book that I had purchased in 1973, and I started. Steve mentioned it one run. Are you tracking your miles on there? What do you mean tracking your miles? He said, what I do is he gets a big 12-month wall calendar that you could write notes on. So that's what I started doing. At the end of every day, after every run, I would write it down there. And at the end of the month, total. You get a blank book and you just put it in there. Basically, what I did was I would save those calendar pages just to make sure that I was getting the right totals and whatnot. So by the end of 1973, didn't really have a whole lot of miles, 525 miles, And I can see here when I look at the book, it was actually in August of that year when he told me about that. I missed the first part of the year. From mid-August on, I have all that recorded and all the way to the present. I just started doing that to the present. Now, in 1992, when the running log books became real popular, I started using those. From 92 to the present, I still use those. But as I'm looking at this book, it seems like 76 was the first year, but 2 years later, 1978, local road racing took off. Seems like every local community, not your bigger ones, but your local communities like Portage, Dunlow, Beaverdale, and of course Johnstown, they all had either a 5 mile race or a 10K race. And I see here in 1978, I did travel to Butler. I ran their Butler 10K and went over to Altoona. I ran their 15K. I like the longer distances. I think it was 1977. I missed the first year, but Spring Cove, it was the old Spring Cove School District, which is Roaring Spring. They had a 5 mile run, and that thing probably ran for about 20, 25 years. They started in Martinsburg, and you ran to the Cross Cove Middle School. It was rolling terrain through the Martinsburg farm country, but you know what? They got some tremendous crowds. That was probably one of the first local races that got over 200 runners. And they did it like Boston. It was on Memorial Day, 12 o'clock noon. So if the weather was 80, 85, you ran. They had water on the course. And that was probably one of the first races I can remember that actually had trophies for awards. And I think they were one of the first races that started doing age group awards too. That's fantastic. It was a great run. But halfway through, I forget what the name of the hill was. There was a hill, and it was like running up Eisenhower. There was only one way to get up. You had to run. And there were some great times there.
Let me ask you about the running scene again. When did you find a woman running or a woman in any of these races?
Okay, that's a good question. It had to have been into the 80s. I do not remember even Richland. I don't know if they had a girls cross country team at that time. I know they had track, but girls cross country, oh boy. At a road race, boy, it had to have been into the 80s, and there were a couple good local runners. Oh boy. I would have to say, and by the 80s, I had started to run marathons, so it had to have been about that time. It was a good 10, 12 years after I had started road running before you see one or two female runners. And I'm almost positive the first couple female runners, and they were good, were from Blair County. I bet you had to be into the mid 80s. And then the first name that comes to mind was Leslie Sense McDowell, who became a good triathlete. She's in the Cambria County Hall of Fame. She would run a couple races. She was a good 10K runner, and she would routinely be the first female. There might have been maybe one or two others after that. It really a good female field. Boy, I bet you locally, now I could be wrong, but I'm thinking it was late 80s before a lot of
Yeah,
female.
certainly in the mid 70s. I'm thinking about track and field. Richland, for example, had some great athletes. There was a woman called Sharon Hagridge. She went to the state track meet, won the javelin, and it established the record. It was the first time around 1974 or 75 that Pennsylvania allowed women to throw the javelin.
That was a problem too. That was just a few years after that Boston fiasco in '67, where, they didn't want any female runners on the course. It took into, or was it the '70s before female runners were accepted and allowed to run in a lot of events.
Let's talk about your venturing up in distance. You talked about running 10Ks, 5 miles, 15K. How high up the distance chart did you go with your road racing?
I ran the marathon. By the end of the '70s, I was doing 70 miles a week. And everybody that I run into, and it had to been one of the Molnars or somebody else, who said, "Why aren't you running a marathon?" I said, "I'm a 10K runner." And I said, I don't really want to run a marathon. I don't feel like I have to do anything. My goal at that time was to run a really good, fast 10K. I did manage to get some 10Ks on the road down under 34 minutes. My fastest 10K in the Johnstown area, I believe, was 33:26, which sounds pretty good, but I was either 10th or 11th. Either the winning time was probably 27 or 28 minutes, but that's neither here nor there. But 1980, there was just so much peer pressure that I upped the mileage again. And I was running between 70, 80 miles a week. I was going to run the Johnstown Marathon. I figured, why just do it locally, get my feet wet, see what it's like. The training went well. The racing was well. So I'm entered in the Johnstown Marathon, not knowing what to expect. I had a good race. 2:48 I ran. In fact, my marathon career by choice was short. My last marathon was 1986. So 81, 82, 83, 84. And I didn't run any in 85 because 1984, I had a bad experience. I mentioned it in the book during the Johnstown Marathon. I was probably at my peak of running performance. I was actually running second in the 84 Johnstown Marathon. I think it was Dan Kunkelman that won that year. I can't quite remember, but I was running second. I got to 4:03 back into Johnstown, and it was a warmer day, and I was just running well, way too far above my level, and I just cramped up severely. So we started that run walk back into Johnstown, pick up the pace when I could. I got to mile 24, and I was it. There was a race official there, and he said, "You okay?" I said, "Eh, not really." I got to ride back into the start, and was able to run the next day. I felt really bad about that. That was my only DNF in my
Right.
entire
Wow.
racing career, but I just blew apart. I was just running too fast for the conditions. If I would have slowed down, I might have been able to probably make the top 3, but it wasn't the big.
Yeah.
85
What
was
about
recovery.
what about the world of sport, the world of athletics? Did you have a coach at all of any of this time, or are you getting more help from
That
Molnar and the other guys?
that is an interesting story.
We'll do this in audio. You're into the from the through the 70s into the all the way through the mid 80s. What about coaching and peer coaching? What were you doing with all that?
Again, there wasn't a whole lot of peer coaching. Some of the Richland coaches, whether they be football or cross country, tried to give me some pointers and whatnot. Mr. Hambright, remember Mr. Hambright?
Oh yeah, he was a 440 runner at Penn State. We
Yeah.
called him Chief.
Yeah, he was a good coach, but road running was different. So I would politely listen and say, okay. The only really good advice, again, was coming from the Molnar brothers, other than your national things from the running publications and whatnot. Pretty much the start of my running career, I was on my own. What I was taught at Bishop McCort, and you hear from some other runners, you had to take it with a grain of salt because runners are different. And road racing, road running, completely different animal. What I did at McCort was completely different. In fact, I was in a race one time with one of my former football coaches, and he complimented me. He went from McCort to Central Cambria. He was teaching up there, and it just happened that he was running that race. It was one of the Johnstown 10K races in the fall. We got to talking, and he said, "I've been following you. You've been doing pretty good." And he said, "Do you think what we taught you at McCort helped you?" And just me pausing and hemming and hawing around, he said, "I knew you were going to say that." I said,
Who was that? What was his name?
"Ray Martiniska." He taught him a court for a couple of years. He was actually my freshman football coach. He was there for a couple of years. I think before I had graduated, he got a better offer at Central Cambria, and he went up there. He was from the Martiniska family in northern Cambria. As far as I know, he's still with us. He was a good coach. He didn't do much in track, but he was a good coach, and he turned out to be a good person to talk to at some of the races.
Let's go back to that beginning area while you were at McCort. They had some good football players there. Were you on the teams with some of those people who would go on to play in the NFL?
Yes, my classmate, Jim Bradley. He went from McCort to Penn State. He did have a tryout with the Bengals. There was a knee injury, so he was out. But you see him now every Sunday on the sidelines because he's a Steeler orthopedic doctor. Even though he's my age, 70, he's still doing it because he loves it. Now, before my time, a lot of great McCourt players, Jack Ham, Pete Duranko, Steve Smear he played up in the Canadian leagues for a while. So there were quite a few. Those three names come to mind right away, but there were probably a few after that.
Do you know the name Gary Rivniak?
Yeah, I do remember him. Didn't he play for Chicago? Chicago
Yeah,
Bears?
our backyard's touched. So he was a lot older than me, so I just remember him as this giant who would be across the hedge. Very nice guy. Yeah. Much earlier.
You mentioned about the McCourt tie. I did some checking one time after I got involved in writing about races. To the best of my knowledge, I am the first McCourt graduate to complete the Boston Marathon. I ran Boston in 1984. There have been one or two others after that, but I'm almost positive I was the first one to do that. When I ran in 84, the crowds are starting to grow, but I think the field was still under 7,000. In fact, it might have been closer to 6,000 at that time. I ran it, had a great time, good finish, but I had no more desire to run it after that because of what happened, how it expanded and whatnot. If you wanted to run a good marathon, you can go somewhere else and get a better time. Fantastic experience, but of course, in 86, I ended my marathon career anyway.
Let's talk about the other parts of your career. You studied history at UPJ. When did you get into professional writing?
That was much later. After I graduated, I tried to go the route that most people with a degree like that would go, and that would be civil service. I tried. You pick a federal, state agency. I tried, but at that time, it was very difficult. There was something going on that people don't want you talking about. But I'll remember for the rest of my life, there was a couple of those civil service exams I aced. But because of what was going on at the time, depending on where you were in the food chain, you were given extra points. So if you aced, like say, the postal exam, and you had a veteran, which I had no problem with, they were getting extra points. A good friend of mine was a veteran. He also aced the exam. He got the extra points, but he never got hired either. It's just what it was. I went a different route. Somebody suggested, you know how to talk to people. Why don't you get into retail? And I did. And you know what? I was able to stay in the greater Johnstown area. All my friends, even a lot of my siblings, they were leaving in droves. Besides me running in the 70s, I was helping people pack up and leave. It was awful. My whole neighborhood in Oakland emptied out. Let me think. Is anybody left? Well, my sister has the old homestead, one family across the street, but all the kids left too. I think, yeah, everybody's gone. It's just the way it was.
Billy Joel made famous the steel mill town about eastern Pennsylvania. Not everybody knows that Johnstown had two giant steel mills, both Bethlehem Steel and U.S. Steel. What do you remember about the times when they were closing down?
At that time, I'm going to probably remember this to my last days too. I was working for Gloucester Brothers GB in Richland. At the time, I was in the auto center. I was working there, and a customer come in. Then about 5 minutes later, one of our mechanics came in who was out on a parts run. He said, "You got to see what's going on down the road." I said, "What do you mean?" So they had just built it was a new store. It was Mason's. And everybody was stopping along Bedford Street there. It was after the floods, so it was probably 78, most likely. They were lined up from the door to the store, down across the plaza below, and then they wound up again to the door and wound back down to the entrance down by Dutch Mate. It was a snake line. There had to been 3,000 people there for retail jobs. That's how bad it was.
Wow.
And the Tribune shot a picture of it. They went to the old gas station up on top and they shot down there. And that's just an incredible picture. Every day we would get at GB 50 to 100 people coming in trying to put an application in. Because I just lost my job with the mill. I got to support my family. What are we going to do? Not everybody was offered those jobs in Indiana or Burns Harbor or High Spire and whatnot. They were let go and they didn't want to leave the area, but they were doing their best to find something. And that was sad. That was sad. I felt fortunate because I had a good income, was never laid off, and had good benefits. Retail at that time was different. I did that for about 22, 23 years. And then, unfortunately, GB went the route of what happened. They closed their doors because the family members got older and they had reached out to a partner who was based in Ohio, and they come in and basically dismantled the whole local chain. And I was out of work, but not long.
You mentioned there were 360 some in your graduating class in Bishop McCort in 1970, right. 71. Do you know how much that shrank just a decade later?
Boy, I bet you it was cut in half. During my time, too, you had mentioned before about something. When I attended St. Benedict's, and even when I attended McCort, the church was paying your tuition. The families were not. That actually happened after my time. Now, all my younger siblings, the year I graduated is in 1970, another school opened up, which was the Greater Johnstown Votech. All my siblings went to that school. I was the only McCort grad in the family. I think Brother Kevin might have went there one year because at that time the Votech school was only 10th through 12th grade. But oh yeah, the late 70s, the 80s into the 90s were terrible. Actually, they still are. People are just still leaving the area. There are some groups doing some good things for the area, but you're up against that huge deficit and you're just never going to recover from that. People I grew up with left. They're not coming back because their kids are now entrenched in somewhere else.
Sure.
That hurt the running scene too, big time.
Were you a running fan? Were you paying attention to the larger running world, to the local high school scene?
I would look at it a little bit. Again, road racing was different. I would follow the cross country runners and I would follow some of the milers and 2-milers. Boy, you hate to say this, but I noticed a trend in the late 80s into the 90s where schools had less students and the track cross country was competitive. And the workouts went from preseason to year round. And then track and field went from being involved in 1 or 2 events to 4 and 5, where the PIAA relaxed those rules. And I'm positive that's why you don't have as many local runners getting into road racing or other things because they're burnt out in high school. And you could take that same thought into football, basketball, and any other sport because everything became year round. They were burnt out. They were literally burnt out.
Let's get to your writing. After retail, during that career at GB, and when did you start writing professionally?
Well, I was always fooling around with trying to write that all-American novel or short story or whatnot. I did a lot of that. I actually had some shorter things published in the 80s. I got back into it again. It probably was because in the early 80s, I can't remember if it was before Boston, after Boston, I had moved to Richland and I'm pretty much living by myself. So I had the time, working full time, good income. So I started writing. Another part of that story was somebody said, Richland's looking for a cross country coach or an assistant, I think it was. Why don't you try? I did. The credentials were there, but I wasn't a teacher. At that time, the union, okay, they didn't really want people coming in out of the area, which you could understand. You had qualified teachers who could do that. So it never worked out. Well, another running friend at a race had mentioned, he said, yeah, you communicate well. Do you ever think about writing for any of the running publications? And I said, wow, that may be something to look into. So I did a little bit. That was before the internet. I found a monthly running newspaper called the Runner's Gazette, based out of Lewisburg, PA. And I said, we'll try. So I put a couple things together and sent them in. They liked them. It took off from there. By the end of 1986, I was writing for them pretty much full time. You get into later the 80s, I was covering the local road races. In fact, if you could find some of the old WJAC film clips of the Johnstown Marathon, it's their videographer and me during the interview. And I wasn't on camera, but it was me asking the questions.
Do you know who the videographer was?
No, I do not. I
Okay.
do not. I cannot remember who they were. They weren't the regular newscasters at that time. Bill Wilson was still there, and Tim Rigby was coming in. He was a younger newscaster, but they weren't there. It was just basically a cameraman.
Who were the biggest stars that came into Johnstown? You mentioned Carl Hatfield. Was he about the biggest, or?
Good question. In the very first Johnstown Marathon, a real famous ultra marathoner, Park Barner, from out east, Mechanicsburg or Harrisburg, he ran it. There was a couple other runners too. I can't think of his name right now. I'm going to have a 70-year-old mental collapse. He became I don't know if he was the CEO, but of Nike Incorporated. He won.
Kerry Green told that story with the making of the
He won
film.
the Johnstown Marathon one year as a Penn State grad student. And then he later became a high-ranking Nike official. He might have been the most famous, if you want to go that route, to run that. Now, there were a lot of good, decent local runners that came in from the area, but those are the ones that stand out. Of course, Dan Kunkelman. Later on, when all those IUP grads, you mentioned Dawn Slusser in some other interview, knew Dawn would come in. And then he married Tammy. They would come in and race a lot.
Let's talk about the genesis and story of you writing your running book.
I retired when GB closed. I started interviewing at UPJ. A lot of my customers were up there in the administration, faculty, and staff. Getting hired was real easy because they knew who I was, and they see me running. They knew who I was, so I started there. And when I retired in 2016, I always thought that, boy, I got some neat running stories. So that's what we're going to try to do, is put a book together. My first year after retirement, 2017, I pretty much put it together. Besides writing for the Runner's Gazette, I was doing a column at that time for the Johnstown Tribune Democrat, and I was also doing the same thing for the Somerset paper, the Daily American. And I found out through just communicating with the editor, they had a book division. And I mentioned to him, hey, I'm putting a book together about my running exploits. And he said, let me know. We'll take a look at it and see what we can do. Most of 2017 was spent writing, editing, and whatnot. In 2018, I submitted it to them. They said, hey, we like this. Hey, we're going to publish this. And they did. In early 2018, they published it. It was published by the Daily American Press. Unfortunately, I'm going to say this, unfortunately, the day my book was handed to me in the little ceremony, the business manager who I worked with told me this is his last day of work. At that time, 2018, the Daily American got bought up by Gannett News, which owns USA Today. And boy, they just started cutting. By a year or so later, they were down to a skeleton crew in Somerset. The bottom line is, since my book was published, I have gone through 5 newspapers who have folded. Now, 2 of them have a digital presence, but they're not the same. And I'm thinking we are on the cusp of losing probably both newspapers in this area. And it's not because of anything that they're doing wrong. The newspapers now are owned by investment firms. They're interested in the bottom line. They make more money in multimedia events. Print newspapers are a dinosaur. Books are a dinosaur, unfortunately. I'm a book collector, book reader. I'm an avid reader, but I do recognize that industry is a dinosaur. We live in a visual age, and that's just the way it is. It's just never going to go back. But that's pretty much how it started.
No, I want to talk about your book. What's it called? How did you figure out what was going to be in it? What chapters are in it, and how did you lay it out?
Actually, my title, and the editors like it. It's called My Running Odyssey by me.
Who's on the cover?
It's actually me. The first picture is of me running Boston. The second picture is of me doing the old Johnstown 10 mile. It was called the Spirit of Johnstown 10 miler. And the last one is a little bittersweet. My very last road race was in 2017, race number 500 for me. I was developing some medical issues, had no idea what was going on. My doctor couldn't figure it out. To make a long story short, It turns out I had a mess, and I do mean a mess, of herniated discs in my back. Actually started going to a neurosurgeon at Allegheny General in Pittsburgh. They ordered some newer MRIs with contrast, where they put an IV in your hand and they shoot dye in you halfway through the MRI. And they were able to see this. There might have been 4 herniated discs. I actually had one operated on in 2018, and I just had one in April of this year, another one. The disc compressed, that nerve's caught in the middle, and it's like sciatic pain. And it pretty much ended the racing career. And I still ran on it because I didn't know any better. And the neurosurgeon said, you know what? We're not going to tell you to stop running. It kept it from getting worse. After the surgeries, I couldn't run for about 4 weeks or so, about a month. So I would start back gradually. I'm in the rehab stage again. This surgery was longer on this one. It was a little bit more involved. It's going to take longer to get back where I was a year before the surgery. But I mentioned a little bit about it in the book because at the time this was published, it was right before the surgery. I didn't know what I was facing. Now I know, and it's just one of those things. Running kept from getting worse.
What's the scope of the book? When does it start in your life, and when does it go to?
It actually starts when I started road running. So it starts with my junior high days at St. Benedict's, running the roads. There's a couple stories in there that, again, you're out there running in the late 60s, and people didn't do that. Not in the Johnstown area. They didn't do that. I really didn't have a whole lot of people try to run you off the road or anything like that.
I did.
Vehicle incidents were more like 2 cars coming at the same time. The roads were narrow, though. You just had to move out of the way. I did have a lot of incidents of people yelling at you from their car, but they didn't realize that, okay, I'm running the other way, they're running the other way, and whatever they said was just muffled because they were going. So they were, as far as I know, they could have been yelling, "Hey, George, how you doing?" And
yeah, they're just talking to themselves.
I started from the first time anybody would ever yell at me, I just wave. Hi. Now, some people will recognize, hey, that guy just waved, so they'd honk the horn. I was very fortunate.
I used to get a lot of Hut 1, Hut 2, people figuring I was trained to go in the Army.
Yeah. If you had another hour, we could talk about what the running scene is like now in the Johnstown area. I passed 3 young ladies who I knew. We do have a running club. It's a Facebook-based thing called the Johnstown Running Club. I passed them on my way home this morning. I swear, I know they run together because they have no choice. The one lady was running with a dog. I'm almost positive the other lady was armed. That's just how it is now. I am seeing that more among runners and walkers. People are exercising armed, and unfortunately, they do not have a choice. You don't want to be a victim. We had an incident 2 months ago in the Johnstown area. It was a member of the Johnstown Running Club, a young college-age student. She was running in Westmoreland County, and an armed guy tried to kidnap her. He actually fired shots at her. She stopped. She fought. Luckily, the other traffic stopped too, and somebody called 911. They were able to subdue him, got the gun away from him, and he was caught, convicted. The state police were right there within moments. But it's just how it is. We've gone from pleasant runs to, I know that a lot of the officials don't like talking about it, but there are some sections in the Johnstown area you have to be real careful of. I run in a suburban area. I'm very fortunate. I run early morning. I do not have issues. The people I see on the road, I see all the time. And they honk, stop, how you doing, how's it going? A lot of people, because of me writing in the Tribune, and I mentioned about the back surgery, they'll stop and say, hey, you're looking pretty good.
That's great.
There's one guy, he pulled up my first day of running again after walking for a month. He said, you're still running faster than I can walk. So you got to take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Do you know the story of Art Smothers?
Yes, I did. There was a race there. It was a 10K race in Johnstown. It started at the point. What they were trying to do, the race directors, they were trying to imitate the Pittsburgh Great Race. So it was called the Johnstown Great Race. It started at the point, and we were all running around there. I actually had warmed up that way, where him and his girlfriend were shot. Whether we heard the rifle shots to the day of the race, no.
Yeah, so if people don't know the story, Art Smothers was a young African-American high school runner for Johnstown. I remember the one conference cross-country race, I won it, Jim Lambert won it, and when we graduated, Art Smothers on it. He was a very good runner.
He was
And
very good,
and
very friendly.
and it was it during the race, a sniper shot him. He was in a mixed race couple.
He was in a mixed race couple, both very friendly. And to this day, I do not know why he didn't run that race. It was well advertised. By that time in the 80s, again, you didn't have the internet, but what race directors would do, they learn real quick, okay, you contact the local newspapers, you contact the local media, and also you have your race flyer printed up beforehand, and you take it to all the other races, or if you know a runner who's going to be at some of these races, give them to them. And I was doing that because I was going to races all over the place. I was taking different races. But he came to watch. And again, there was, if I remember, probably about 150, 175 in the run. We had started outside the point and we ran up Main Street. And if I remember right, we ran into Moxon out and back, a 10K race. So apparently he must have been shot after the start because nobody that I knew that was running remembers hearing any kind of rifle shots or anything like that. There were so many of us there that we didn't really know what was going on until after the race. That part of it was cordoned off. I seen the police and the presence of the emergency vehicles. I figured it was some kind of wreck, automotive wreck. Busy.
This was late 70s or early 80s. I don't remember when. I think it was late
This would have been
70s.
in the 80s. Actually, if you want to fill in here, I can go to my running book here and see if I can find when that race was.
Right.
It was the Johnstown Great Race, is what it was called. So it was in 1980.
And
June 15th of 1980.
that does mark the tragedy because it was the day of that race. And then while you're looking through that book, have you added how many miles have you run that you've logged in that book?
Since I'm a Stephen Molnar protege, and I did record all those miles, I ran over 100,000 miles in early 2017. I'm right now, I still do that. I still track all the miles, everything. Of course, we're a Garmin watch now, so it tells me how many miles I've run, but I'm over 109,000 now. I don't think I'm going to hit 110 this year. I'm going to get very close to 110,000. If I don't do it in December, it'll be in early January.
What about the change in sports, the change in road racing that's happened over this time from the late 70s up to now with the massive crowds, all the issues in sports? Is that something you deal with in your writing? The transgender issues, were you writing about or aware of the conversion to professionalism of the sport?
I basically stayed away from that. I would follow it, but I've found in my writing that people, especially when we got into the 90s and the internet and social media taking off, that people were being bombarded by all of this information and they wanted an outlet somewhere where they can get away from it all. And running still provides that, as does walking and hiking. So my writing is basically about what I see as I'm running. The sights, the weather. I will mention different things that are going on, but I'm leaving the whole political aspect of that to other people. Unfortunately, there are so many of them, more of them out there. So basically, when my writing now is about what I see on the road, I will mention some other things, but it's pretty much just describing what I see. That way, people have a break from the nasty part of the news.
Is there anything else you want to get covered?
We had mentioned about how we saw very few female runners in the 70s into the 80s. Today, it's complete opposite. We have a Johnstown base, and it's basically Cambria, Somerset County, but it's Facebook based. I'm going out on a limb here. I'm going to say 95% of those runners are female fitness enthusiasts who got into running. And it's just incredible. I seldom see another male runner.
Wow.
The generation I grew up with have left the area. with the exception of a couple of the Molnars. Denny Cruz, if you remember Denny Cruz, he was from Conemaugh Valley. He was big into tennis, but he got into running too. He's still running. He's still in the area. There's very few. It's just incredible how many female runners are out there, which has created a whole new issue of verbal abuse. What I mentioned with that incident with the armed kidnapper potential. It's a whole new world out there. And so many of these younger runners have skipped 10K running, skipped marathons, they got right into ultra running. They're out there running 50, 100-mile runs. I got to mention this right now. We have a young Conemaugh Township graduate. She's 18 years old. Her name is Kaylee Frederick. She was the first youngest runner to be accepted into the Badwater 135. She just ran and completed the Badwater Ultra Marathon, which is from Death Valley to the portal of Mount Whitney. Ran it in 40 hours. Incredible. Made running history. She represents that new generation. The lady, Ashley Paulson, I think her name is, she won Badwater outright, smashed her record. It seems like female runners are making some great strides today, which is great. We need more of that. I'd like to see a few more male runners out there. My generation, I know, I'll see them. We converse on Facebook and whatnot, but it's just part of that generation just left. They're gone. They're never going to come back again. They went where their kids are. So they're in Virginia, the Carolinas, or wherever. So I'm out there pretty much running by myself every morning with the people I wave as they're going to work. That's just how it is in the Johnstown area.
Are you still a fan of the bigger world of road racing or athletic?
I do follow it because, that was my life. I do follow it a lot. Some of the things I don't really care for, the politics of it, how the nonprofits got into it, and they made entry fees just incredibly expensive. They are doing a lot of good things with that money, but when you go from starting out as a road racer and paying $4 or $5 for an entry fee, and you get all kind of incredible things, now it's not impossible to run a local 5K and pay $50, $75, and you're lucky you get a bottle of water at the end. You're on a course, you have your time, and you're going to have all kind of Facebook publicity, but is it the same?
Yeah, I know I talked to a race timer, Chuck McGarrett, a guy I know for a long time. He has a race timing company, and the cost of security and course enforced sometimes by the local authorities, what you have to pay there is just contributed to that a lot.
Yeah.
George, it's great to talk with you and reminisce. There's so much of my early history was in that area too. So the names and finding out, I apologize, I was a young, stupid kid. I don't remember the times we ran together, but it's amazing. And you have such a great thing over 50 years view. And it's good to hear that you're still running an amazing career.
Well, I thought before the back surgeries that I would be able to race into my 70s. That's something I heard at the 50th high school reunion. Boy, are you sure you're in our class? Wow. It's that all those years of running. I mean, running does keep you from growing older. I mean, I do have some back issues, but I'm dealing with them. And I'm thinking once they fully heal, I'm going to be beyond that. I will not go back to racing again, just to be on the safe side. But I was running before the surgeries a good 30, 40 miles a week. I think I'm going to be able to do 30 miles a week without an issue. And to mimic the racing, some of them runs, if I'm feeling well, the weather's good and there's no ice on the road, if I want to take off at a 7-8 minute mile pace, I'm going to do my best to do it. That's the future goal.
Good for you. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.